in my life.
Hey guys,
Something
welcome
called
back to another
the
video.
Cooper
My
River.
mom was being
Let's zoom out for a second. As I've been explaining the monsoonal rains that would hit the Wadi Sura, it's been very localized. We've been just looking at one area and the two lakes, ponds even, that would form there. But I want you to remember that these monsoon seasons swept across the entire continent. They would have been inundating the entirety of northern Africa in massive seasonal rains. Okay, I'm going to take back entirety. Maybe there's a few places that didn't get it. Maybe there was a guy with an umbrella. I don't want to see a single goddamn comment. So understanding Wadi Sura is important. But now we have to look at how it fits into a much bigger puzzle of the entire ecosystem of North Africa during the African human period. All of the water that flowed off of the Gulf Canal Plateau down Wadi Sura into the two lakes would eventually flow into a much bigger river. In a 2012 paper entitled The Kufra Paleodrainage System in Libya, a Path Connection to the Mediterranean Sea, Philip Kalu et al. Writes about the discovery of one of these massive paleodrainage networks. This team hopes to identify a 550-mile or 900-kilometer long paleodrainage system in Libya. This is what Kalu has to say about how immense the watershed for this ancient river would have been. The Kufra River corridor watershed at its maximum extent would have covered more than 150,000 square miles or 400,000 square kilometers, representing close to a quarter of the surface area of Libya. That is about the size of 15 months. Using radar, Kalu's team was able to identify this massive paleodrainage system, and the team found that there would have been three major watersheds that all led into this river. One of them on the slope there at the Gulf Canal Plateau, another watershed to the east to the south called Grenat. These two sites made up the eastern side of the drainage basin, and on the west side of the drainage basin was the eastern side of the Tibesti Mountains. And so all of the water from this more than 150,000 square mile watershed would have flowed into one river. The remains of this ancient river can still be seen as a scar on the land. The 250-mile or 400-kilometer long north-flowing corridor that used to be the Kufra River. Interestingly, if you look at a map of this area, you can see that the Kufra River actually used to flow through what is now the Kufra Oasis. It's a little patch on the map that you can see with a town in it called Al Jaf. There's some, irrigation circles and stuff in there, a little bit of farmland in pretty much desert in every direction. Oh, I gotta say, not great with ice. You guys were right. Now, while I didn't look too much into the details of this particular oasis, I'm going to use some context clues here to infer that the reason that there is water present at this location is because it is a deposit of fossil water, as it's called. Fossil water can be found all over the Sahara Desert as a relic from the African humid period. Water that has percolated deep into the ground and has remained in aquifers and not evaporated. So while I'm sure there's a little bit of rainwater and groundwater that still percolate into this basin, I wouldn't be surprised if the reason there is still some water in this area is because of this ancient river that used to flow there. From Al Jaf, the ancient river narrows, and it ends up cutting a canyon through the bedrock running another 250 kilometers, where it finally returns to grade and turns into an alluvial fan, a delta, before all traces of it are lost under the Cisco Sand Sea, which is a massive tract of moving sand dunes that has covered that region of the Sahara Desert. So what is on the other side of the Sand Sea? Where is this ancient Kufra River flowing to? Does it end up out in the Mediterranean? Well, eventually, yes. But before it gets to the Mediterranean, it flows into something else, or would have flowed into something else. At the end of the Sand Sea is the remains of another much bigger river, because the Kufra River was just a tributary of the enormous Wadi Sahabi Paleo River. Look, I actually have original sheet music from the Stein song. A new arrangement by Rudy Valley. Isn't that kind of cool? Look at that. Who am I kidding? Why would you care about this? At the other end of this enormous sand sea lies the remains of another Paleo River. We're going to use some context clues. There is this river, huge watershed, all flows north, covered by the Sand Sea, and then there's another river directly above it. Now, you and I might put our heads together and say to ourselves, well, I think in all likelihood, the Kufra River probably flowed into the Wadi Sahabi Paleo River. And yes, that's probably exactly what happened, but because that middle part is covered with sand, at the end of the paper talking about the Kufra River, the author ends by saying, we propose that there may be a connection between these two rivers. Now again, I'm not saying you should speak without knowing, because we don't know yet, but that's just what I love about science, is look, we don't have object permanence. All the things can be right there there, but if we don't have that clear line of sight between them, you don't publish the paper. And that's why science fucking works. The Wadi Sahabi Paleo Channel is absolutely massive. It is between a half and 2.5 miles in width, which is about 2 to 4 kilometers. That's about the distance that I had to walk from my dorm to Ohop, to the spring, to the sky, to the trees and their glorious happiness, to the calling. Further evidence for the size of this river comes from how deep it is. The channel eroded by the Wadi Sahabi Paleo River is more than 980 feet deep, or about 300 meters, carved directly into Miocene carbonate strata. This is more than like a riverbed. This is something closer to a canyon. Now this implies that the water that would have fallen at our lovely little Wadi Sura would have flowed all the way down into the Kufra River, a paleo drainage system of more than 150,000 square miles, about 600 miles to the north to an absolutely enormous river before finally flowing out to the Mediterranean Sea. But the Wadi Sahabi River is actually very, very old, way predating the even first instance of the African humid period 800,000 years ago. There's evidence to suggest that this riverbed may date back as far as 50 million years to the late Cenozoic period. Now, this is a time that is so far back that we're not going to be going into it, but the world would have been a very, very different place.
Don't ask why I named it like that.
Scale at this point. The story we're talking about today is like climatic shifts and, Milankovitch cycles and stuff. But when you're going back 50 million years, we got to bring plate tectonics into that. I'm not going to do that to you. You got shit to do today. Now, during its zenith, potentially in the Cenozoic period, this river is believed to have had a discharge equitable to that of the modern-day Nile River. That is, I need to read this number. What? 2,830 cubic meters. I don't know if that's right. But the connection between this river and Wadi Sura would have been established about 15 million years ago. Still a long time, we're not going to go back there, but a little bit more recent. But this means that for the last 800,000 years, every time water would flow all the way from the Gulf of Air, all the way back into the Kufra River, into the Wadi Sahabi River, and out to the Mediterranean Sea. While doing research on these sites, is that it was really hard to do research on these sites. There's not even done in the Sahara Desert. Don't get me wrong, there has been a lot. Much of the region has been mapped with LiDAR and satellite imagery and has been explored pretty extensively. But in the grand scheme of regions of the Earth that we know a lot about, the Sahara is one that just hasn't had that much research done in it. But what's wonderful is that you and I are living in a golden age of archaeology. It's a renaissance. A time where regions of the world that haven't been looked into all that much are finally getting the attention they deserve. And so why is that? Why is it that the Sahara contains the potential for so much history? Well, humans like to do this thing where we like to drink water, because if we don't do it, we shrink it up. As the saying goes, water is life. Humans have a lovely habit of settling along water pretty much wherever we are. If you do find a human settlement that isn't on water, there's probably some other kind of weird reason why it is where it is, but for most of human history, water is kind of the thing that we needed to do. So when you think about the size of the activities of these lakes, the bodies of water that would have existed on them for thousands of years, they would have been about something which has been used a lot by some of the alternative history people. They use it to support everything from that lost advanced codes, something until there is evidence to support it. I think there's a lot of evidence that some of the biggest discoveries in archaeology. I had to get excited about archaeology for a second. Also, all right, let's get back on track here for a second. A little bit of this system is really impressive and very indicative of how complex the system would have been during the African human period. It paints a much better picture of what the world would look like. But this is far from the only example of how large rapid water resulting from this monsoon impact. And I think the most important thing that we need to talk about is the amazingly named Lake Megatron. On the border between the modern countries of Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon is a lake. It's called Lake Chad, and it's pretty small in the grand scheme of things. It covers an area of about 770 square miles, or about 2,000 square kilometers, which is about twice the size of Mountain State Park, and has a maximum depth of about 6 feet 7 inches, which is about the height of Casey Tatum, or Celtics, or should I say, no, Cardinals. Also, update on Phillips here, you guys are disappointed but not remotely surprised to hear that Phillips guys actually win that many hits in that It's 20 minutes long, and this is the So I need to be totally honest, I haven't actually watched this video yet because I have work to do. But I have been doing it. Let's just say that if you have open our hearts that Philip was actually going to turn around this into engine price and like a Wi-Fi how to show his price. If you dislike those shows, negative, but you know, there's not enough likes for you to really go off that. So I think the comment section is a little bit better. Just looking at these comments here, it doesn't really seem like the consensus that well thought out for his argument. I'm not just like cherry picking comments here. It goes back. Here's the next five. Here's the next five. Now obviously I'm going to do a response to this because, man, how could I not? Philip, I doubt you're watching this, and I doubt you even watched the video that you responded to, but if you are, I want to say that I haven't started scripting this video yet. In fact, I haven't even started watching it, so there is still time to take this down and make a mature, well-thought-out response. I haven't seen it yet. The record is still clean with me, but you have about a week, because I'm really excited to start scripting this, and once I've seen it, the cat is out of the bag. So, alright, we'll get back to the video now. I just thought it was worth noting with this. This happened. Well, this lake isn't all that large today. At one time, it was much, much larger. For this section, the most valuable resource I used was called the West African Monsoon Dynamics Inferred from Abrupt Fluctuations in Lake Mega Chad by Simon James Armitage. Simon, for taking the time to write this paper and help me on this video so much, you, sir, are the real Mega Chad. Lake Chad today is just the lowest point in what was once a massive lake bed. The lake that did exist there, Lake Mega Chad, would have been 600 feet or 180 meters deep and covered an area of 150,000 square miles or 400,000 square kilometers. This is larger than the Caspian Sea. This thing would have been absolutely gigantic, and the drainage basin that fed it was 400,000 square miles or more than 1,000,000 square kilometers. At the bottom of the lake bed, archaeologists and geologists have found the remains of transverse dunes. Now, these dunes actually predate the lake, meaning that they were deposited before the water filled in around them. And these dunes are dated between 19 and 16,000 years before present. Now, I hear one or two of you asking, well, how do you date a sand dune? That's a great question. Quick tangent here. The sand dunes were dated with something called OSL dating, or optically stimulated luminescence. The way that it works is use a bunch of science magic to figure out the last time that a grain of sand was in contact with sunlight. So by looking at that, you can figure out that it was colored, how fast it is, how long it was structured. So this proves that the sand dunes at the bottom of Lake Chad were deposited before the start of because of the sand dunes, which is still on right around 14,500 years ago, the monsoon rains have managed to push this far down into the country, which means that rain began to fall into this catchment basin, eventually draining into the Chad. Of course, this would have been two small lakes. One in the Chad basin, where the Chad is now, and one to the north, the Rollo basin, which no longer has open. As rain continued to fall, year after year of monsoon would eventually make the overflow the past. Now, it is one of the next rising, and eventually one Lake Chad will fill this as a part of the overflow. This point is about 225 meters above sea level, where Lake Chad would have then overflowed its banks and continue its way down the Caspian Basin. This overflow would have flown into the Danube, where rivers would eventually out into the Atlantic Ocean. Mega Lake Chad would have reached its zenith about 11,500 years ago, and evidence of the lacustrine or lake sediments that are left over from its existence show that it would have been a rich ecosystem. There are evidence of mussels, seagrass, fish, and birds that would have run down at the time. And for a lake that's larger than the Caspian Sea and existed for almost 10,000 years, it's amazing to try and think about what sorts of ecosystems would have existed there that we just can't even see anymore today. And in the course of just around 1,000 years, one of the largest lakes on the planet disappeared. And now that we have a picture of what the world would have been like around that time, it's time to narrow it back in, because we will take a look at an archaeological site that changed the course of history. That's where we're going this time for the local area. Depth of 25 feet or 8 meters. Right before the beginning of everything was dry and so huge sand formed the sand sand and nothing in every direction, they're covered in grass, and there's fresh water all around you, and there's migratory birds, and you're in like this little isolated peninsula sticking out into a big lake. It's no small wonder that people wanted to live here, not only with the food and natural resources, but because it was some prime real estate. And the creation of these sand dunes about 16,000 years ago is known as Phase 1 of the Gobero site, the very beginning of the African human period. Gobero technically has 8 sites associated with it. They are labeled proven that some of the first people to arrive at Gobero was about 9,700 years ago. And in the history of this site, this is known as the start of Phase 2. During Phase 2, the Gobero beachfront real estate company was home to a group of people called the Kifians. The Kifians, like many other hunter-gatherer groups at the time, arrived at Gobero to follow its natural resources. They were drawn by the fish and cereal grains around these lakes, and also by the other wild animals that were drawn to them as a source of fresh water, easy hunting grounds. And the tools they left behind showed just how well adapted they were to this environment. The Kifian people hunted both fish and big game. For fish, they had barbed harpoons made out of bone, beautiful carvings that have instances that have survived all the way to this day. Not only this, but they seem to use a type of spear embedded with microliths, tiny flakes of knapped stone that would make a spear beyond lethal. And the Kifians were the first to establish a cemetery at this site. So let's have a look at what might be the most famous burial from Gobero, and potentially the most famous Kifian burial of all time. And that is the Accordion Man. This is the skeleton that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and I told you I was going to get back to it. I actually didn't tell you that. You just trusted me, and I appreciate that. The Accordion Man dates back about 9,000 years. With their average height easily above 6 feet. But you'll notice that the reason for his unusual name is because his skeleton is very compact, like an accordion. To put that in a little perspective of just truly how compact he is, this 6'2" man, his remains are now in what is it? Oh yeah, 10 inches or 25 centimeters long. This dude got squished. Now this illustrates to archaeologists that he was tightly wrapped upon burial, potentially with either ropes or animal skins or something to keep him really condensed. And this is a theme that we actually see in other Kifian burials, where it was customary to sort of wrap and bind the dead into kind of a little bundle before burying them. But around 8,000 years ago, something changed. The Kifians kind of disappeared, and all traces of them at the site begin to vanish. This is the beginning of what is known as Phase 3 of this site. It's about a 1,000-year period from 8,200 years ago to 7,200 years ago. ago, and during this period, the area received a lot less rain, and it seems like human habitation, or semi-permanent human habitation, ceased almost altogether. But about 7,200 years ago, the rains returned, and this kicked off Phase 4. By this point, a new culture of people had arrived and called the sand dunes at the beachfront resort home, and they were called the Jupitererian people. Not only did they occupy the same dunes as the Kiphians, but they ended up adding to the same cemetery. As far as I can tell, one of the oldest of the Jupitererian burials is a little more than 7,000 years old. He's been given the nickname the Turtle Man, which is understandable considering that he is buried in the top of a turtle carapace, or a turtle shell. Post-production Milo here, he was actually buried on a turtle shell that was under his hip, not in the turtle shell. It was not a human-sized turtle, or a turtle-sized human, for that matter. It's an unusual burial that seems to bring in the compaction of the Kiphian burials with the kind of sideways fetal position burials of the Jupitererian culture. I don't know if there's any evidence to suggest that these people were related to one another or how their cultures may have melded, but I do think it's kind of interesting to see that this person was also bound really tightly and literally placed in a turtle shell to be buried. The Turtle Man is the oldest burial at Jupiter that has grave offerings associated with it, indicating the beginning of a change in culture. The inclusion of grave goods in a grave is something that indicates a lot about the culture that people live in. But beyond that, the actual burial itself and the position that they're in will tell you a lot as well. Another that I mentioned earlier is the Halloween Man, who was part of the Jupitererian culture, and his remains also date to about 7,000 years ago. Now, the most striking feature of him is the fact that his teeth are filed to points. This is the oldest evidence that we have on the African continent of someone having their teeth filed to points, which is a cultural practice that still exists in some parts of the continent even to this day. The Jupitererian people had pretty meticulous burials. Most of the individuals were laid to rest on their side in the fetal position. Take, for example, the also aptly named Pot Pillow Man. Dating to about 5,500 years ago, the Pot Pillow Man, another member of this culture, was laid to rest with his head on a ceramic jar. Continuity error check. My mic died, so I had to film on a different day, and all that's changed is it is currently 80 degrees, and my basement is full of water. Okay, anyway, that really has literally nothing to do with this video. What were we talking about? Oh, wow, this is a really depressing time to have to come back into this. Jesus. One of the most dramatic examples of the Kiphian burials at Gomero is sometimes referred to as the Stone Age Embrace. If you Google the Stone Age Embrace, you will also find a bunch of other archaeological discoveries called the Stone Age Embrace, which is a little bit confusing, but I don't know, it was a catchy name, so it stuck. It's the grave of 3 individuals, a woman and 2 children, all holding hands. It's a pretty heartbreaking burial. And not which is like some to speculate that these people are the result of the ground. We're able to engage with something that people will never comprehend. But even though we're not so that the both of these people that they deserve, not only for those particular mother and her children, but for the other members of the community. After all, there's sufficient evidence that this was a burial. People were not buried in further evidence for their judgment of the different people after their death to the various known women. This all goes back to about 6,000 years before Christ. The soil tells us that the closest population about 100 miles ago in the United States. It was a really great place to be buried one of their members on their side of a better cloud. This gives us a tantalizing peek into what the culture has been bringing in this area. The grave contains the remains of an elderly woman that was buried wearing a necklace. This necklace in another grave known as the Bracelet Girl, the remains of a 10-year-old who passed away about 4,800 years ago is found wearing a bracelet made with a hippo inside it. With it, there are stone tools and stacked around the site, so it's evidence that there was an extensive trade network. Not only are there stone tools made of plant material found in the Air Mountains, but there's also decorative pieces made of a mineral called Amazon. This is a more rare material also found in the Air Mountains. One of the more unusual artifacts recovered from the Jupitererian site is known as the Jupitererian disc. It is made of the same weird prism that was transported from the more than a small circular disc. There's currently no consensus on what it actually was. Some suggestions that it was a but remember, no other theories that look at this stuff. Others, like myself, think that it was more likely some sort of non-functional object, either traded and bartered with other groups in the Green Sahara. And just like the Kithian people, the Jupitererians left behind huge middens. A midden is the fancy archaeology word for a giant pile of garbage. It actually provides some of the best information that you can get in an archaeological site. Both the Kithian and Jupitererian middens tell us a lot about their diet. In these piles of refuse, archaeologists have found the remains of a myriad of creatures. Animals like catfish, turtles, elephants, warthogs, wildebeest, and what was the other one? Elephants? Did I already say elephants? Elephants, as well as, towards the end of the occupation of the site, domesticated animals like cattle. This history of the Sahara is corroborated by archaeological sites and rock art, and they help us paint a wonderful picture of what the world looked like. Absolutely massive, measuring 20 feet or 6 meters in length. In fact, they are the largest This is known as the African story. Take for example this part known as the beautiful carving is dated to around the start of the African human period about 7,000 years ago. Legend says that the Herder is the one that carved the giant house, and that he was grieving the loss of his herd after particularly the part of the ground. It is not remotely impossible that the oral history has been handed down year after year after year for thousands of years throughout this region, and in the glory of the giant house. Granted, we will probably never know the ground truth of these carvings, but we don't know about and how long oral memories can be passed down, it sounds like it actually could have a shred of truth in it. The former hunters and gatherers of the African human period began to rely more and more on agriculture and animal husbandry. But no matter how much they began to refine those techniques, they were running from something that was unescapable. Humanity's true great equalizer from the beginning of time to this day. The climate. About 4,000 years ago, the last acacia tree at Gobero withered, dropped its leaves, and died. The Earth's wobble was rapidly returning to center once again. Year after year after year, the monsoons got a little bit smaller. Their range reached a little bit farther, and by about 3,000 years ago, they had ended altogether. At Gobero, this period can be seen about 4,200 years ago, when the last human inhabitants departed the site for the very last time. The final iteration of Gobero known as Phase 4. Today, all that's left in this region is wind-blown sand, and dry riverbeds that would be lucky to even see a drop of water in a single year. It's the only way we have ever known the Sahara, a vast, empty expanse of desert containing almost nothing. The African human period may seem like something which is intangible to us, but all across the Sahara Desert today, there are little shadows, glimpses into the ghosts of the monsoon. It is really difficult to view our world as something that changes. The human lifespan is so short that most of the change that happens on our planet is something that we can never really fathom. This is when it's important to zoom out. Instead of looking at you right now in the world that we live in, I want you to look at your place in the timeline of humanity. Throughout the 150,000 years that Homo sapiens have walked the Earth, we have experienced all kinds of terrible stuff. We have experienced ice ages and sea level rise. Volcanoes, meteors, freezes, thaws, droughts, fires, tornadoes, you name it, we've been there. But these things that happen on a grand scale are really hard to grasp. But no matter how hard they are to grasp, the trauma of climate change that humanity carries with it is something which can be seen all throughout our world. And there's actually some really good examples of this from the Green Sahara. Take, for example, Ethiopia in East Africa and Mali in West Africa. These two groups are pretty different from one another. They speak different languages, they have different customs, they believe in different things. Despite their differences and being divided by literally the largest desert on the planet, they have a few words that are really, really similar to one another. These two groups both share a very similar word for hippo, and this is a pattern that can be found in a couple different cultures throughout Africa. Lingering relics that suggest that all of these different people had cultural ancestors that once spoke a language in the Green Sahara. Cultural ancestors who were exposed to the immense biodiversity of what was once an enormous grassland. This is why teaching history is something that is so important, because even though history is all the old stuff, it really impacts how we live today. By understanding the past, we can better interpret the future, and we do ourselves a disservice by not adequately teaching science and history. By teaching people these things, you give them the tools to be able to interpret it for themselves. I've said a million times before when talking about pseudoscience that the number one thing to combat pseudoscience is education. It's not me sitting here dunking on people, it's giving you guys the tools that you need to teach your friends how archaeology works. The amount of conspiracies that revolve around poorly interpreted geology blows my mind, and it blows my mind even more to know that none of this would happen if people had had a single geology class. But the thing about history and science is that it's something that requires a lot of work to be able to understand. Science is not the type of field that you could just show up in and be like, yeah, I think it's like that, and so it's like that. This is also why I believe people have a really challenging time conflating modern climate change with the way that the climate has changed in the past. Because we don't have any education about this stuff. But if we were to have any chance at succeeding in the future, we need to be able to look back at people as people, not as primitive barbarian savages or highly advanced Atlanteans or as the ever-pious indigenous. We do so much to view our ancestors as something other than us. We either pedestalize them to these ridiculous standards, or we crush them under our boot heels trying to claim that we have somehow gotten better than they were. But the truth of the matter is that neither of those are the case. The truth of it is that they were just like us. These people who called the Sahara Desert home were not Atlanteans or cavemen. They were people like you and I. People who thought like us, people who cared like us, who believed like us, people who buried their dead on a bed of flowers. It's important as archaeologists and historians to not lose our humanity. I want you to not only think about how these stories impact where you are in the human story, what we can learn from them, what you relate to about them, or what stuck with you the most. But I also want you to think about what this means for us in the future. The Tenarians, the Kithians, and countless other unnamed groups existed. It was people like you, people like me, people like anyone who is watching this video. But today, all that's left, not only of their culture, but of their world, is a vast expanse of sand. Every ruin on the planet is left behind by a culture who once thought themselves invincible. And truly, the most human part of it all is that every single one of them has always thought that what happened to them could never happen to us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. I hope you found this deep dive entertaining, and who knows, maybe a little bit informational. If you like what I do here and you're a returning viewer, welcome back, and thank you for joining me for another one. And if you're new here, whether you're just checking this out while you have lunch, or you're putting it on in the background while you clean your room, I'd like to welcome you to... Look at you, thinking I couldn't fit another continuity error in this video. Pathetic. If you did enjoy me keeping you company, consider checking out another one of my videos. Or if you have a friend that likes to play long-winded videos in the background while they do household chores, feel free to send this video to them. Consider it like tipping the bellhop. I make a video that you get to watch for free, and all I ask is you help boost the algorithm a little bit. Helps what you do, helps what I do, everybody wins in the end. And lastly, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Patrons get early ad-free access to all of my videos, and all of your names will be in the credit of this video as a token of my appreciation. If you'd like to become a patron, link to that is in the description of this video. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's all I have to tell you today. I'd like to thank you all very much for watching this video. My name is Milo Rossi. Remember to stay curious, stay inquisitive, and most importantly, remember to stay hydrated. I don't think I could think of something better than that. Yay! This video will be covering topics that some viewers may find disturbing. While all of it will be in an educational format, it will contain images of burials as well as discussions of death and violence. Viewer discretion is advised. Vampires. You know them, you love them, you have a weird obsession with them, and according to the Smashing Pumpkins, the world is one of them.
The world is a vampire.
These fictional, blood-sucking creatures have captivated the minds, hearts, and fantasies of many in the modern age. They've inspired television shows like What We Do in the Shadows and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They've inspired books like Salem's Lot and Twilight. They've inspired movies like Salem's Lot and Twilight. And what's that other one? Interview with the Vampire. I haven't seen it, but I hear it's good, apparently. And even music that I will reluctantly admit I listened to much too recently. But for this video, we're going to be going back to a time when vampires weren't heroes, heartthrobs, or cartoon villains, but instead were viewed as a legitimate threat of supernatural origin. A time when paranoia and superstition around the occult resulted in innocent people being treated with the accountability and brutality reserved for demonic entities. Howdy friends, my name is Milo Rossi, and today we're going to be exploring these superstitions and the grim archaeological evidence that sheds light on those whose lives and afterlives were marred with the brutal superstition of the vampire. I already said brutal, didn't I? I don't know. We'll leave it. What's the worst that can happen? It sounds like shit. Fine. Title card.
Squishy. Squishy. My spine controller.
Uh-oh. You guys see that?
It's supposed to be a controller. A squishy controller, but it's broken.
It is 45 degrees in the studio right now. Last video was 65 degrees. At this rate, 3 videos from now, I'll be dead. YouTuber and archaeologist Milo Rossi found dead, frozen in his own home. How this is even possible, we have absolutely no idea. So the reason I was inspired to make this video today is because of a video that I made a very long time ago when I first started out on TikTok. It's some of my good old-fashioned debunking content and dates back to a terrible time in my life. A time known as October of 2021. Whoa, is it actually? Hold on. What's today? Whoa, I may have actually recorded this like almost exactly 3 years ago. That's crazy. Either way, let's give it a watch.
Vampires used to roam the earth, and you can't convince me otherwise.
Yes, I can. Watch this.
These are burial places from the medieval times, and they were to prevent the undead from escaping from their graves.
They are, and they weren't. They are called ward safes, and they were invented in the 1800s in England. It was common practice for medical students to learn anatomy on real human subjects. The best place you go to find an abundance of these subjects is a graveyard. The living didn't want to see their deceased family members exhumed and put under the table by a bunch of hungover frat guys. They started to do this. They would lock the bodies into the ground.
Oh, wow. Classic. My hair was a lot better back then. What was I doing with it? God damn, look at that. That's luscious. This was one of my first videos to get like 10 million views, which I was stoked about. And it was just some guy doing like vampire pseudo-archaeology. But anyway, this video did so well that I decided to make another one like a week later because there was more people talking about the same bullshit.
She's proof that vampires used to live on the world.
Oh boy, another video about vampires. I feel like I've heard about all the arguments that there are for vampires at this point, but since it is the season, I suppose I will hear this young man out and see if he can change my mind.
Young man? That man was probably about the same age that you were, Milo. Sit the fuck down. Wow. Look, I don't want to hear a goddamn thing about it, okay? I was in like a manic episode, alright? Now, the thing that he talks about in this video is the Vampire of Venice, a human skeleton found with a brick lodged in its mouth, which is vicious and horrifying, and was likely part of the superstition of people thinking that she was a vampire. Does this mean she was actually a vampire? No. But what I think is really interesting about these discoveries is that even though these people weren't vampires, the superstition still meant that they were treated as if they were. And as I looked into this phenomenon a little bit more, I found that this discovery was just the tip of a horrifying iceberg. That despite vampires not actually being real, the mere superstition of them means that we have archaeological evidence of people who were accused of being vampires. So I think in honor of these videos from right as I was about to transition onto YouTube, today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the horrifying world of vampire burials. But I think in light of today's topic, we're going to need a little bit of a mood change. First, as an homage to my amazing fashion sense from 3 years ago, we're going to need a little bit of a costume change. And second, we need to wait for the sun to go down. I want to to start a band. It's going to be composed of a harpsichord, a theremin, a slide whistle, and the triangle. I'll see you after dark. Jesus. That's easier. How the fuck?
Squishy.
Wow, I have outdone myself this time, folks. That's fucking crazy. Ooh, I bet you can't see me at all standing here. Welcome to my video. Okay, only one last thing to do and we can get this bad boy going. I think that the only appropriate drink to have with a video like this is a bottle of wine. Milo, who are you drinking the wine tonight for? Because the boys. Now, of course, as we can see, it is almost 40 degrees in here. So didn't really think that part through, but it's all in the name of content, you know? Oh, Jesus. It's only been there for 120 years. Let's put a hole in it now. There better be sick, like, organ music playing this entire time. Which way is it again? Okay. That's the way. I like it. I found this thing in the garbage. I was gonna say more, but honestly, that's just fucking... That's good enough. Oh my god. Jesus fucking Christ, this is not the height this is supposed to be used at. There we go. Anyway, this is why I found it in the garbage. Straight up not working. Look, that gag was gonna be so good if it actually fucking worked. Oh, I was just being an idiot, actually. It completely works. You aren't supposed to pull it back again. Okay, now we're ready. Okay, let's start the video. Let's get vamping. We suck in tonight, boys. You see my breath? I can see my breath. Can't see your breath, though. Or can I? It is the summer of 2018, and an archaeological team led by David Soren is conducting an excavation in the Umbria region of Italy. It's in a little town called Lugnano, and the site that the archaeologists are working on is the ruins of a 1st century Roman villa. Now that seems like a pretty logical place for an archaeological excavation. They weren't actually there because of the villa. Instead they were there because about 400 years after the villa fell into ruin, it was repurposed. In about the 5th century AD, this ruin was converted into an impromptu graveyard. A graveyard which locally gained the name La Necropoli dei Bambini, or morbidly, the Cemetery of the Children. At the time of this excavation in 2019, the remains of 50 different individuals had been found there, and as the name suggests, they were all quite young. The eldest discovered up until this point, a female, was only 3. But during this excavation, the archaeologists discovered something bizarre: the unusual burial of a child uncharacteristic of anything else found at the site. The remains were found in an improvised tomb made out of roof tiles from the collapsed villa above, and they were from a 10-year-old whose sex was not able to be identified. But the thing that set them apart from the rest of those in the cemetery was not only their age, but the way that they had been buried. This individual, for whatever reason, had been buried on their side with a stone lodged in their open mouth. The stone had flecks of mortar on it, indicating that it had also come from the ruin above. This told archaeologists that this was not just a piece of rubble in the ground where the child had been buried, but had been placed there intentionally. This grisly discovery came as a shock to the archaeologists, who had never discovered anything quite like like it, and it earned this discovery the nickname the Vampire of Lugnano. Now, the logical question here is why? Now, this cemetery had been started in around the mid-5th century because of a massive outbreak of malaria. During this outbreak, younger populations would have been hit exceptionally hard, a morbid trend that you can see indicated in this graveyard and is likely the reason that this graveyard existed in the first place. Now, the Vampire of Lugnano also had an abscessed tooth. This symptom is indicative of someone who died from malaria. That candle just melted straight through and just burned out inside. That's a little creepy. There we go. Now, at the time, the good people of the 5th century probably did not have a great idea on what malaria was, how it worked, or the processes by which to avoid it, which likely resulted in an immense amount of superstition. One of the primary reasons for why this individual was buried on their side with a stone in their mouth is based on the superstitious belief that they could rise from the dead and infect others, and that these burial precautions would prevent that from happening. Now, why this child was treated in this way while other ones in the cemetery weren't is currently unknown. Perhaps there were some other extenuating circumstances around their death that would have warranted them being buried in this way. As we will see later, accusations of vampirism are something that go far beyond just the way that an individual died. As strange and disturbing as this burial is, it is far from the level of grisly creativity that would come to arise in later vampire burials. In fact, the Vampire of Lugnano, buried in the 5th century, actually predates the idea of a vampire, or at least a vampire as we know it. While the vampire superstition wouldn't arise until about 800 years later, these haunting burials highlight a fear of something that long predates the vampire. Something that our modern world has mostly forgotten. Something referred to as a... I was downstairs getting ready for this video, and I was like, oh man, what kind of glass should I use? And I was gonna find like a cool chalice or something. And I opened the cabinet, and this was the first thing that I noticed, and I was like, shit, I gotta use this stupid-ass cup in my vampire video. 'Tis the season. There are many theories as to where the vampire myth came from, and like any piece of superstition or mythos or fable or legend, it's almost impossible to actually nail down a single concrete source. Instead, they are something that just morph through time as they are told and told and told and retold and change pretty much indefinitely. And I would imagine that there's probably been some kind of superstitious fear around the dead rising again since, like, as long as people could die. The idea of a vampire is something which, as we'll see, originated really in, Europe, but literally like every culture around the world has some variation of the dead rising again, whether it be in a physical form, a spiritual form. I genuinely think that if you just, left 10 people on an island who didn't know anything about the outside world, eventually they would have their own superstitions around the dead rising again. Okay, anyways, let's go back to the beginning a little bit here. Before there were blood-sucking vampires, there were revenants. This is a superstition that really begins to be seen around the 6th or 7th century AD, and it's sort of a blanket term for entities born out of the beliefs and superstitions of various pagan religions. And this is exactly why we can find vampire burials that predate the actual idea of a vampire, because many of the superstitions and precautions surrounding revenants were things which carried over as it was later adopted by Christianity. And we have pretty significant archaeological evidence to suggest that these superstitions also vastly predate the idea of a revenant as well. Take, for example, a grim discovery made by construction workers in the Saxony-Anhalt region of Germany. While working on installing power lines, a construction team discovered human remains. It really is amazing how many of these stories start with the construction worker finding them. It would be insane to stumble across that while you're just on your day job. The Bog Bodies of North America video I did a while ago started in the exact same way. She's like, oh, we're gonna build a housing development. Corpse. Anyway, they called in archaeologists to come analyze the site, as they should have, and what they discovered was the grave of a man around the age of 50. He was buried on his side, which is a little unusual, and what's even more unusual is that his grave contained no grave goods, offerings, evidence of clothing, or burial rites. But the most unusual feature of this grave was that he had been buried underneath a massive stone. Not like under a stone, like a headstone, like a stone had been placed on top of his body. This huge flat stone was about 3 feet long and 2.5 feet wide and estimated to weigh around 110 pounds. This thing come undone? No, my little fucking thing is undone. Don't let him catch you without your thing. And this massive stone was placed directly on top of the man, with his lower body and legs crushed beneath it. The hypothesis is that this was also to prevent him from rising from the dead. Now, what's so amazing about this site is that it dates back a staggering 4,200 years. Almost 3,500 years before the idea of a vampire would even come close to materializing. And this burial is attributed to the Bell Beaker culture, a culture that I'm sure you you all know so much about because it's so commonly talked about all the time. I'm kidding. I had never heard of it until I made this video. Someone get on that. Northo2. I feel like Northo2 should do a video on that. Everyone go ping Northo2 to make a video on the bell beaker culture. Now, we're unsure of what the good people of the bell beaker culture would have called the guy rising from the dead and haunting the living. We do know that they clearly had some sort of superstition around it. And if it really is the case that this was a precaution taken to prevent someone from rising from the dead, then this is an indication that the same superstition to prevent this from happening persisted for more than 4,000 years. Because, as we're about to see, this exact same strategy of using a huge rock to pin a body down was a method that was also in use when it came to actual vampire burials. Which indicates that while the ideas, concepts, and reasons behind the dead rising again have changed a lot over time, some of the superstitions around how you're supposed to deal with it have actually remained the same for thousands of years. Now, the idea of a vampire as we know it today really began to take shape as pagan practices were co-opted by the Christian church. This may come as a bit of surprise, but before Christianity, a lot of people were pagan, and so the Christian church kind of needed to pander to these people in order to make them think that their guy was better than their guy. And to do this, the Christian church did a whole lot of things sort of pulling from pagan religion. They would kind of co-opt some of their holidays and festivals. They would allow pagan people to still practice some of their beliefs as long as the Christian ones were done alongside it. They would, kill all of them. Little things like that that really make you interested in Jesus and stuff. You know what? I'm sorry, guys. Actually, there's no paganism in Christianity. That's just heathen stuff. It's a complete coincidence that St. John's Day is on the summer solstice, or that Michaelmas is right around the fall equinox, or that Jesus just so happened to be born like right near the winter solstice, or that his resurrection is celebrated around the moon cycles of the spring equinox. So anyway, sort of co-opting pagan beliefs, it made Christianity a little bit more palatable to the masses. And by around the 10th century AD, it was the Roman Catholic Church that had co-opted, among other things, the pagan idea of a vampire. What I find to be also very interesting about this is it sort of illustrates how, while beliefs and dogmas have changed through time, every single idea that we have today is pulling things from much older versions. The idea of a vampire may be sort of new, but we've sort of been handling it in a traditional way that has been handed down for literally thousands of years. Christianity, a fairly new religion, but it pulls from things that have been handed down for literal thousands of years. This isn't a theology lesson, but I do think it's something that is kind of interesting. Now, as the Catholic Church began to sort of Frankenstein on elements of other existing beliefs, the Catholic Church would allow for some groups of pagan people to continue their burial rites and rites and rituals around the dead, as long as the Christian ones were practiced alongside it as well. This obviously wasn't the case in all places, but by doing this, they sort of allowed some of the pagan beliefs around death and spirituality to sort of make their way into the Catholic Christian dogma. And one of the ways that the pagan fear of the revenant began to combine really well with a Christian ideology was the Christian idea of the soul, with Christianity claiming that the soul is a separate entity of the body and can exist outside of it. This married very well with the idea that the dead didn't have to stay dead. Again, like with all cultural and societal phenomena, there's really no time that this happened. This is something which took place gradually and imperceptibly. But it was the marriage between pagan superstition and Christian conquest that would pave the way for the entering into the Middle Ages is when the idea of a vampire really kind of started to take shape. And as time went on, the fear of the legitimate threat that these creatures posed to the living began to rise to a simmer. Now, in the beginning, these weren't blood-sucking creatures. Initially, it was believed that a vampire could kill you simply by looking at you. But that had to be nerfed because it was absolutely broken. Bad day to be a vampire, though. That would really suck, you know? You're telling me I used to be able to look at these dudes, now I gotta suck them? Now, over time, these creatures began to morph. Instead of being vengeful spirits that rose from the dead, they started to become demonic entities, which honestly is, I would say, a little bit scarier. You know, it's one thing if fucking old, Jim rose from the grave because, he was pissed off at you because you didn't mow his lawn that one time. But if you start telling me that old Joe's rising from the grave because Satan told him to do so, I'd be like, give me some of that Jesus, Now, needless to say, once this thing started to become about Satan and demons and all that stuff, was when the simmering fear sort of rose into a boil. And there is nowhere where this panic was felt quite as viciously as in Eastern Europe. Again, there are many reasons for this, but one of the ones that I think is really important is that at the time, and probably for many generations afterwards, and some could argue probably even to this day, There was an immense amount of generational trauma. You see, around this time, the area had been absolutely devastated by multiple wars, especially in Poland. The trauma of loss and destruction brought on by a vicious war is something that would have permeated really deep into sort of the psyche of the people at the time. And so it's not all that surprising that a place devastated by war was particularly susceptible to superstition and the fan flames of religious panic. Priests working for the church just exacerbated this situation by pointing the finger at witchcraft and demons. This, of course, went on to ignite the Christian fears of demonology and the pagan superstitions that lay just below the surface, which is why it is here in Eastern Europe that the fear of vampires exploded into something much more similar to
Yo, how's it going, everybody? I want to pop in here for two reasons, one of which is very important. The not as important one is check out this sick hoodie. I think there's sort of a haunting beauty to vampire burials, and I wanted to try and pay homage to it with a piece of clothing. And so we made this sick design. Now, the second and much more important thing is that this design is going to a good cause. You are here right on time. Come here. As some of you may have heard in the news cycle, Hurricane Helene, this lovely lady right here, my girlfriend, went to school in North Carolina. It is where we met. We spent much of the early part of our relationship in North Carolina, and so especially to her, it's a very important place. So this lovely lady did the design for this. I'll pass this on to you.
It doesn't have a ton to do with Asheville, but we felt like it was really important to do what we can, especially with Milo's reach and audience, to just get the word out and continue to send funds to Asheville. It's been almost a month since all of it happened, and with how quickly the news cycle turns over, it's really easy to hear about the hurricane, be devastated for the first couple weeks, and then move on with your life. But a lot of the people in my community who I love are still dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. My teacher, who is like family to me, doesn't have a way to shower in clean water right now. It's still brown coming out of their tap. So it's really important that we continue to do work within that community and other communities near Asheville that don't have as much of a draw, that have been pretty much wiped off the map.
We are going to be donating half of all the proceeds of this hoodie to Beloved Asheville, which is a charity that has been working in Western North Carolina and Asheville long before Hurricane Helene, so we can guarantee that the funds that are raised for it are going to continue going to support the long-running restoration effort in Asheville.
They are a nonprofit that does community organizing on a large scale. They have food banks that they leave throughout the town, and they also just are widely trusted by Asheville as a community. So if you can donate to them, that would be amazing.
I also linked a link to Beloved Asheville's direct donation page in the description of this video. We will be making a donation. I encourage any of you that can make a donation, as much as it would be great to have, more purchases of the hoodie, and all donations will go through that. I really encourage you that if you do have the money to spend, skip the hoodie and just go straight to donating. And yeah, I want to thank you all again for watching this, and thank you for, your support. And I think that with the amount of people that we have here, we can really make a difference. So from Z and I, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We love you. Schminky wants you to donate.
Whoa, don't go play on my soft heart like that. Schminky said you have to donate to Beloved Asheville.
Vampire hysteria over in Eastern Europe began to really ramp up around the same time as probably the most infamous case of mass hysteria ever recorded. None other than the Salem witch trial. In 1990, panic broke out in the rural farming town of Salem on the north shore of my home state of Massachusetts. 30 individuals were found guilty of witchcraft, of which 19 were put to death. Fuck, too many witches. Too many witches. Now, I know what you think when you hear that. You think, wow, that is an excellent opportunity for a tourist-based economy. Look, I'm not gonna hate, okay? I'm a masshole at heart, but whenever I drive through Salem and I see, cute little pictures of witches in the windows, I'm like, you know that they, lynch these people, right? This wasn't like a cutesy, crystal girly shop kind of situation. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. How long does it take before it's okay for a mass tragedy to turn into a fucking tourist destination? I'm thinking about opening up a t-shirt shop in Jonestown. Come for the Kool-Aid? Stay. Now, the witch trials were pretty insane. Even though only 19 people were put to death, more than 20 people were accused of witchcraft. That's a lot of people. Wait, did I say 20? Did I say 20? I meant 200. If I didn't say 200, I meant 200, not 20. Well, the root causes of the Salem witch trials are something which are undoubtedly going to be debated until eternity. What is clear is that this was not an isolated incident. Around this time, across the Anglo-Christian world, panic had broken out over the presence of demonic entities, and the fear of demons, Satan, witchcraft was at a fever pitch.
Yeah,
At the same time as the Salem witch trials, a different kind of occult-based panic was happening across the ocean, where the fear of vampires had transcended from an old superstition into a genuine concern. And as a result, people were persecuted accordingly. Take, for example, this instance, which is recorded by an Austrian official in about 1725. This story takes place in a town in Serbia. One of the townspeople, a man by the name of,
aerodynamics.
Petar Blagojevich. Petar Blagojevich. How'd I do? Yay! I didn't do very good, did I? One of the townspeople by the name of Petar had passed away. After his death, they did all the things you do when someone dies. You know, bury him, get really drunk, all that stuff. So normally when someone dies, it's kind of over once the last shovel goes in, you know? But not in this case. In just the 8 days following Petar's death, 9 other people in the village would die of a sudden and mysterious illness. Now that is a little bit weird. But what makes it even weirder is that almost every single one of them allegedly claimed to have had visions of Petar strangling them. There are even versions of this story where it said that Petar would return to the house of his widow and son and demand to be let in. In those versions of the story, it ends in a few different ways. In the good version, the widow and the son flee town. And in the bad version, the widow flees town and Petar breaks into the house and kills his son in cold blood. Now, needless to say, people weren't exactly thrilled that all of this was happening. It was a little bit weird. So they went to the priest and they were like, dude, this is like kind of your thing, right? And the priest was like, this is completely above my pay grade. I'm going to try and get some advice from the church higher-ups. We're going to figure out what we can do about this situation. But that wasn't good enough for the villagers, and frankly, I don't really blame them. After all, allegedly, multiple people have been killed by Ghost Peter. You never know if they're going to be the ones next. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. As the story goes, the townspeople exhumed Petar's body to inspect it for signs of vampirism. And when they did, they found him as though he had just died. His skin was unblemished, his nails were a little bit longer, and allegedly his once clean-shaven face now had a beard. As you can imagine, the townspeople weren't
And his once clean-shaven face now had a beard.
I know what we gotta do about this. So they dragged Petar out of the grave and staked him through the heart, where, again as the story goes, he bled as though he had just died. Now to really drive this point home to Peter, they decided to finish the job by building an enormous funeral pyre and burning him to ash. At which point, allegedly, the hauntings and mysterious deaths in the village stopped altogether. Now, did this actually happen? I have no idea. Is it very possible that this was the result of a disease in town, something like that, and it was a compounded series of unrelated circumstances that resulted in this crazy outlandish story about man rising from the dead? Quite probable. Is it a sick story nonetheless? Abs-fucking-lutely. But either way, there's no use playing Monday Night Quarterback with this, because at this point, people genuinely thought vampires were a threat and that they were killing people. And so elaborate rituals were concocted to keep the dead actually dead. Just like at the Salem witch trials, the things that drew accusations of vampirism varied immensely. But unlike at the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, most of the people who were accused of vampirism were already dead, which I guess was good for them, because it was not good for the people in Salem. Because vampires are something that rose from the dead, it was normally the circumstances around a person's death that would draw accusations of vampirism. So real quick, I think it's important to go over the many bizarre reasons that people would be accused of being vampires. Reasons that people may be a vampire, speedrun. You died a violent death, skill issue. Did you die and then there was a natural disaster after you died? Your fault, vampire. Were you the first to die in an epidemic that other people would then die of? Your fault. Oh, here's a pretty big one. Are you unbaptized? Yeah, I can smell that. Are you from here? No? Vampire. Were the rituals and ceremonies around your death not good enough for me or our village? Then, probably a vampire. This one I'm not going to make a joke about because it's a little depressing. But dying at a sort of significant time in your life or in a sort of significant way. This could be something like dying during childbirth or around a marriage, drowning, murder, suicide, execution. I'm just like listing words that will get me demonetized, aren't I? Did you do something that would get you demonetized on YouTube? Vampire. Sure, your death may have been followed by a natural disaster, which would mean you're a vampire, but were you also the first one to die in a natural disaster? Vampire. Do you look a little weird? Vampire. And then, of course, the big ticket item, diseases. Now, I didn't know a lot about diseases, and so, vampire. Did you have, rabies, cholera, malaria, or a mental disorder like, I don't know, schizophrenia or something like that? Vampire. Now, all of these examples are things that have to do with the circumstances around an individual's death. But beyond just these, there's also a whole ton of things that have to do with you after you die that could also get you accused of being a vampire. Was it found that your burial shroud was decomposing faster in your mouth than anywhere else? Vampire. Weird little note here, a lot of the time this was discovered by grave robbers, which I think is funny. You guys aren't gonna believe this. Old Jim over on the hill, his burial shroud's decomposing in his mouth. How did you figure that out? Vampire! Are you dead and someone had a bad dream about you? Well, yep, you're a vampire then. Did a member of your family become ill after you died? You already know the answer to that one. Then there's all kinds of gross ones about blood, like if there's blood coming out of your mouth, out of your ears, if your belly becomes bloated, which are all things that can happen when a person has, you know, died. Is your body pliable? Vampire. Is your body not pliable? Probably also a vampire. I don't fucking know anymore. Are you growing a beard or hair? Rogaine. Vampire. Did you die and look a little bit too fresh? Fresh. Did you die and look a little too fresh? Right on. Or if your body was moved after burial. And if you got, like, uprooted and put somewhere else. Maybe also by those pesky grave robbers. You know, old Jim, his burial shroud was decomposing in his mouth, so we decided to just bury him somewhere else. I decided to bury him in the neighbor's yard. Oh, god damn it, he wasn't a vampire then, but he sure as shit is now. Now, the tricky thing about being accused of being a vampire is that you really can't actually do anything about it in the fact that you're dead. Which normally makes it very hard to do pretty much anything. But for the living, to whom this was probably the greatest level of concern, they couldn't just let you sit there being all vampire-y and stuff. Okay, so what did they actually do to prevent these people from rising from the dead? Now, a couple things worth noting here. One, superstitions and practices varied a lot from place to place. And two, again, content warning, as if you didn't need it already for that whole last part. If you made it this far, I promise it's nothing you can't handle. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately, I guess, there are countless graves across Eastern Europe that paint a grisly picture of those accused. Oh, man. It's getting colder in here. I think I need to put on a jacket. Okay. Look, I was gonna put on like a cool, like black jacket because it would be cool, but it is just so goddamn cold in here that I don't think I have a choice but to put on this wool coat. I am now Boris, the Soviet vampire. I found this jacket at a yard sale, and it was like $10, and I was like, ooh, $10 for a wool jacket, that's kind of cool. And I looked at it, and it has a little fucking tank on it. And then I looked inside it, and I'm like, oh shit, this thing's old. And I'm like 90% sure this is like an actual, like, Soviet military jacket or something. I don't know enough about military history to pin it, but maybe someone in the comments. Look, this is what you get. Have a look. Yeah, have a little look. There we go. Okay, someone can diagnose it from there. But either way, my name is, I'm not Vlad. Vlad the Impala. Vlad the Tame Impala. Is that Tame Impala? I don't know. I don't listen. I'm not a fucking Norman. Let's go to Poland. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of vampire burials in Poland. Oh god, I have to pronounce names now. For example, like at Drasko Pomorski. I feel like that's pretty good, but I doubt it. In this town, archaeologists discovered the remains of a cemetery. It dated to around the 17th or 18th century and contains 6 individuals, and it's believed that all of them died of cholera. That being said, almost every single individual in this cemetery was found buried with the elaborate burial superstitions that are reserved for vampires. In one grave were the remains of a man aged between 35 and 45. Him, just like the rest of the people found in the cemetery, were buried in a simple wooden box. And this individual had been buried on his back with a small sickle over his throat. This was another common burial superstition to prevent the rising of the vampire, as it was believed that if they tried to get up, they would decapitate themselves. I mean, I guess it's kind of smart. I feel like they probably could have just decapitated them, but whatever. There was also the remains of a young woman between 16 and 19 years old, and she was found with a copper headband around her forehead, a copper coin near her mouth, and as if that wasn't enough, also a sickle over her neck. Some kind of restraint is something that will also be seen a lot at these burials. In this case, a copper headband intended to keep an individual pinned to the ground so they couldn't rise again. There was also the remains of a woman between 30 and 40 found with a sickle across her neck and a coin in her mouth. Coins are, and kind of always have been, part of various superstitions, in this case made to ward off evil spirits. It's also believed that things like coins and stones would be placed in the mouths of people accused of vampirism so that they would have something to bite down on, so they couldn't rise from the dead and go on to bite you. I don't know if they thought that someone could just spit the coin out and then bite you, but I don't know, it was worth a try, I guess. Along with this, there remains of a woman between the ages of 35 and 40 who was also found with a sickle over her neck and a coin in her mouth. But this individual also had a crushed skull. Now, it's believed that this was due to heavy machinery driving over the site beforehand, but I'm not exactly sure. I hope that it was due to heavy machinery. I really hope so, because it is also known that one of the other methods of dealing with a vampire is to crush them with a rock. There was also the remains of a woman between the ages of 50 and 60 who was found with a whole smorgasbord of things to stop her from vampiring, a sickle across her waist, a coin in her mouth, and a stone placed on top of her throat to stop her jaw from opening, and a lack of teeth. It's believed that the teeth were removed post-mortem, which could indicate that that was also a precaution taken to prevent her from vampiring. The sickle across her waist is another one that becomes common in later burials. Just like the belief of putting it across their neck, it was believed that if you put it across their midriff, they would cut themselves in half when they rise up, which would be really hard to do, but I guess. Well, again, worth a shot, worth a shot. It's that or a vampire, so you may as well try it. And lastly, the remains of a young individual whose age and sex were unable to be identified, who was found with a stone placed over their throat. This is one of the most expansive vampire graveyards found pretty much anywhere, but it is far from the only one, and definitely far from the only one in Poland. Take, for example, the vampire discovery in Peen. Isn't that the band that wrote, Ocean Man? In the city of Peen, archaeologists discovered the remains of a woman who was buried around the 17th century. Elements from her burial indicated that she was of a fairly high social status, for example, garments made of silk, but, and critically, she had a snaggletooth, which, as we discussed before, could have been enough evidence to suspect that she was a vampire. Though I'd imagine there were probably other circumstances around her death that led people to believe this. But either way, the way we know people think she was a vampire is because she was buried with a sickle across her a sickle across her neck, a coin in her mouth, and a padlock on her toe. This is another trend that was believed to keep vampires from rising, locks either on their toes or shackling their legs together. It is a little bit unusual that a woman of presumably high social status was treated in this way, but again, as is the case with many archaeological sites, we will never know exactly what the circumstances were around her death, which is so goddamn frustrating. Okay, last one from Poland. Why don't we have a look at the discovery from Helm? No, I'm going American. Chelm. realm. Here was discovered the remains of a child's grave from around the 13th century, kind of at the very beginning of when the vampire myth began to resemble what it does today. Now, I'm not exactly sure why this is, but this one is, for some reason, way more gruesome than all the other ones. The individual at this burial site was crushed beneath huge, heavy stones, and as if that hadn't been enough, they had been decapitated and their severed head placed face down into the grave. This is another element of the superstition around vampires, that if you bury them face down or put at least their head face down, they wouldn't know which way is up. I don't know what sort of empirical evidence they were using to try and prove that that was the case, but I don't know, maybe they just really thought vampires were stupid or didn't have an internal compass. Guys, whoa, let's step away from Poland here for a second. This is getting out of control. Let's have a quick look at the mother country, fucking Italy. Okay, we already talked about the vampire of Lugnano, the 5th century remains of a child found in the child cemetery. But that is not the only vampire burial found in the mother country. There's also the vampire of Venice, found in Lazaretto Nuovo, which I actually touched on at the very beginning of this video. It was the one that British guy was talking about in that TikTok. This is proof that vampires used to live in, what did he say? On the world. Was it on the world or in the world? It was something that didn't make any fucking sense. Tell me your little funny jokes, little man.
She's proof that vampires used to live on the world.
Here's proof that vampires used to live on the world. I'm not gonna lie, guys. I'm looking at my outfit that I had then. I got hotter. Lazaretto Nuevo. I tried to pronounce it then too. I probably fucked it up as much now as I did then. Anyway, this woman was found buried in a mass plague grave. This aligns with what we were talking about earlier, that people could be accused of vampirism if they died in a plague, if they were the first one to catch it, or something like that. Okay, we're going to shift our perspective a little bit. Let's have a last little look at Bulgaria. Firstly, let's have a look at the vampire of Perpericon. Perpericon. Here the discovery was made of the remains of a 40-year-old man dating back to about the 13th century. His remains were found staked through the heart with an iron rod, probably the most classic of vampire hunting techniques. This is similar to another discovery made in Sozopol, Bulgaria, where the remains of 2 men dating to the medieval period were also found staked through the heart. And lastly, in Debelt, you gotta put the belt on the pants so they don't fall down. You gotta put the belt on the pants, you're gonna be arrested for public indecency. Here the remains of 6 individuals from the medieval period were discovered, and there is evidence to suggest that all of them had been nailed down through their hands, feet, and torsos. These discoveries are also sort of the tip of the iceberg. There are many more and countless more to be discovered. So while these burials have helped us understand some of the ways that you're supposed to, deal with a vampire, there are plenty more alternative vampire strategies. Many people suspected of vampirism were buried with a few different burial customs for redundancy. In case decapitating them didn't work, you wanted to crush them with a rock as well. Like, dot your I's, cross your T's and shit like that. Some of the ones that we touched on that had a few variations of were classic decapitation. While the site we looked at had the individual decapitated and the head face placed down, in other locations the head would be decapitated and placed between the knees. There are also instances of shackles or locks binding the legs and arms to the ground. Some actually took this idea a step further and just cut the legs off, which seems thorough. I know that I certainly wouldn't be able to rise from the dead if I didn't have legs. I also know that I certainly wouldn't be able to rise from the dead. Another interesting one that we sort of touched on is burying an individual face down. There was some belief that if the individual was not facing the direction they needed to go to rise from their grave, they would either just dig farther into the ground, or instead of biting a person, they'd just bite the dirt. Again, I'm honestly, if I were a vampire, I'd be a little offended, because it kind of seems like a lot of people just thought they were really stupid. Like, if I was an undead entity, do you really think I'd fall for the old sickle over the neck trick? There are also undoubtedly countless vampires that we don't know about because they were cremated. Probably the ultimate move in preventing something from rising from the living is to just make it literally not even exist anymore. And in a weird twist of irony, this is actually probably a decent way of dealing with things like the plague, which people did attribute to vampirism at one point. But I guess bodies are incapable of actually spreading the plague once they have been turned to dust. We've also seen multiple examples of stakes being driven through the body. The classic and most infamous one of these is a stake driven through the heart, but sometimes these were also done in order to pin the individual to the ground. And the last and very bizarre one of these is sewing needles through the belly button, which makes me a little bit uncomfortable even saying those words out loud. But look at you, you're not uncomfortable by that. You're cool and different. Yeah, I don't know, I kind of like gore. I think gore is kind of cool, you know? All of these superstitions seem kind of ridiculous by our modern standards. It's easy for us to sit here with the perspective that we have and look back in time at these people and be like, huh, what a bunch of idiots. But I want to remind you that these acts were committed by people exactly like you and I. These were not some different species. These were not some backwards, twisted barbarians. These were people who were just brought up at a different time. It's easy for us to pedestalize ourselves today, to think that we are so much better and more intelligent than those in the past. But it bears repeating that if any of us had lived at this time, we very easily could have been the person wielding the stake or the one on the other end of it. Because if we look far enough back into the shadows of the past and things begin to get hazy, we take for granted the fact that today we know a lot. Maybe, some might argue, a little bit too much. But as we look backwards into the shadows, we can see that for all of human history, perhaps even until this day, all of our actions have been dictated by one thing: the fear of the unknown. Today, people are not accused of being vampires. You can sit in our living room couches or on our bus ride home from school and look at memes about them, TV shows about them, or read a book about them. They can be funny, they can be a little bit scary, they can be sexy, they can be super gay. But if there's one thing that they aren't, it's real. Now, you can easily say that at the time these burials happened, vampires weren't real then either. But they may as well have been, because they dictated the way that people actually lived their lives. The actions that people took at this time were done with the understanding that vampires were a very real threat. So even if vampires didn't really exist then, does it really matter if people acted as though they did? So what changed? As time went on, many of the superstitions that would make people accuse others of vampirism began to be more understood. Things like germ theory were discovered, unlocking the wonderful and horrifying world of biological diseases. Once we knew what germs and bacteria and plagues were, we did not need to pin things on vampires and the dead. Along with this, science made great strides in understanding death, what happens to a body post-mortem, and that many of the unusual phenomena once attributed to vampires are just a natural part of the decomposition process. In fields like natural science, disasters were understood more. Droughts, tornadoes, floods, and hurricanes all began to be understood as natural phenomena not attributed to the supernatural. And so yet again, the use for vampires faded into obscurity. By the 1800s, the scientific revolution had really found its stride, and with it, it drove the final proverbial stake through the heart of the vampire myth. With so much of a better understanding of the world that we live in, we no longer had need for these baseless superstitions. And so the fear of the dead rising and wreaking havoc among the living, a superstition which had existed for literally thousands of years, finally was hilarious for a myriad of reasons. One,
Hi guys again.
two,
Hi.
do they know barbaric cultural practices are not a market that are cornered in one part of the world? The immediate example that came to my mind was the Spanish Inquisition. You want to talk about ritualistic sacrifice? Or the Salem witch trials? Huh, weird, a bunch of white people killing each other over a religious belief? My point with this is not to point fingers or make some big political statement here. It's the fact that when people are fearful of the unknown, they make terrifying and horrible decisions. This is why it is all the more important to study science and to understand the world around us. Because while it's easy today to understand and accept the fact that vampires and witches have never existed, and that sacrificing people would never change how much rain is going to fall, does any of that really matter to the people to whom that may as well have been true? So finally, while we enjoy this crisp fall weather and watch our favorite vampire shows or movies, I think it's worthwhile to take a moment to humble ourselves and think about how far we've come and remind ourselves of the places that bear the bones of people to whom the idea of a vampire wasn't just a silly fairy tale. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for watching. And I'd like to give a big thank you to all of my returning viewers. Bonus points if you're watching this at the live premiere, Sunday nights 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I'd like to give a big welcome to all of my new viewers. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy this video, I humbly ask you sauce an interaction of some kind. I make all of my educational content on YouTube for free, and interactions help boost the algorithm to let you keep watching it for free. Like I always say, it's like tipping the bellhop, except it's free. I would also like to give a massive thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Patrons get early ad-free access to all of my videos and their names in the credits of all my videos as a small token of my appreciation. If you'd like to become a patron, the link to that is in the description. Wow, well that was a fun one. I've never filmed this late at night before. This is fucking weird. It's honestly a very spooky night out there, fellas. I'm gonna be honest. It is like 38 degrees and raining. There's been like rain like sheeting against the windows of the studio I'm in, and it's completely dark through the rest of the room. It's just, I have one light shining at my face and then the candles behind me. I cannot see anything else. I keep seeing like my reflection in the window off to my side, and it's like startling me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching this video. As always, I hope you enjoyed, and that you maybe even learned a thing or two. Remember to stay curious, stay inquisitive, and most importantly, happy Halloween.
Well, guys, I tried. Now I have such a long video that it's gonna take forever to post. But bye bye. Oops. My cheese stick, by the way.